Good evening, all. Good evening and good morning to all, and welcome to this fifth seminar of 12 months 12 seminar series initiated by Emerging Technology SPG. So today's topic is autonomous or self-driving vehicles. To take us through this topic, we have our own JPP alumni 2003 batch, Mrs. Radhika Marathe, who is based out of Boston. Just for information, Radhika is daughter of our another alumni, Atul Marathe from 76 batch, whom most of you all know personally. Radhika has completed her MS and PhD in electrical engineering and computer science from MIT in 2015. She has been working with analog devices for last 6 years. She has worked in area of MEMS sensors and lidars for automotive applications. She is currently a system architect and domain expert in area of navigation for self-driving vehicles. Today, the, today the transportation industry is experiencing a rapid shift from conventional driver-based system towards autonomously driven electric vehicles. So during this talk, Radhika will provide a brief introduction to the motivation behind self-driving vehicles, the key technology challenges of the navigation and perception about it, the various technologies that solve this problem, including cameras, lidars, radars, GPS, and inertial sensors. She will also cover the current and market applications of self-driving technology, including their social impact. So before handing over to Radhika, some standard announcements. Request all to post questions, if any, in chat window. Radhika will try to cover these questions during the talk. We will have around 30 minutes open discussion post basic presentation, wherein most of the open questions will be covered. At the same time, I also request everyone to mute yourselves so that another sounds won't disturb speaker and other audience too. So without further delay, I now hand over it to Radhika to take us through this very interesting topic. So over to you, Radhika.
Okay, thanks a lot for the introduction. So, hi everyone. Once again, good morning and good evening and good afternoon, based on whichever zone you might be in. So, my name is Radhika. I'm going to talk about self-driving vehicles today, and I'm going to start with some outlines. This is going to be the general outline for what I'll be speaking about for the next 45 minutes to an hour. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the things I've worked on in undergraduate, graduate degrees, as well as during my last few years at Analog. Then we'll go into the introduction behind these self-driving technologies and some motivations behind them, levels of autonomy, that kind of thing. Then I will be talking about the technical component of this subject for the next 20 to 30 minutes, and I will focus on primarily two different technologies which are driving the autonomous revolution. So those are perception technologies and navigation technologies, and we'll go into what these mean exactly during that section. And finally, we'll talk about some applications as well as social impact of this topic. So to give you a bit of background, I grew up in Pune, as you all know. I was at JPP, graduated in 2003, and went to Ferguson College after that. I had a chance to represent India in the astronomy Olympiad at that point, and I think that helped me a lot with getting admitted into Caltech for my bachelor's. So Caltech was absolutely like a dream place. It is a very, very nerdy and very engineering and science focused school. And I got a chance to do summer internships in multiple different subject areas and really explore the field of electrical engineering during that time. So some of my internships were in like astronomy, which I actually did in Pune at the NCRA, National Center for Radio Astrophysics, which is on Pune University campus. And then a couple of others were in neuroscience, which was in signal processing. And the last one was in microfluidics, which is a sub-area of MEMS. And I really liked the third one quite a bit and decided to pursue my PhD in that subject at MIT. So that was a pretty long 6 years of my life. And during that time, my thesis was based on the silicon-based MEMS resonators. In English, it basically means that these are very small micro electromechanical devices. So they're micro, meaning they're very small. They're like micron scale. They're electromechanical, meaning they have some aspects of electronics and some aspects of mechanics within them. And their applications are primarily in these filtering or timing applications, such as clocking systems for computers or processors or any computing platforms, as well as filtering, meaning high frequency filters for communication systems. So beyond that point, since I graduated in 2015, I have been at Analog Devices. So for those of you who don't know about Analog, we are a pretty large semiconductor manufacturer. We started out definitely as a semiconductor manufacturer. Now we dabble in a lot of different areas which are adjacent to electrical engineering. We have definitely expanded into signal processing. We dabble in a little bit of AI, ML type of stuff. We also do systems to a small extent. And I got a chance to look at multiple different parts of the organization over the last 6 years. So I started in MEMS as a product engineer, because that was most aligned with my background at that point. And then a couple of years ago, maybe 3 to 4 years ago at this point, LiDAR was a really, really hot area in semiconductors. And there was huge amounts of investment across the industry. And I had the opportunity to join the LiDAR team within Analog at that point in a design and system engineering role. And that was super exciting. This diagram on the top left was the waveguide, liquid crystal based waveguide technology that we were developing as part of that. And then over the last year and a half or so, I have moved into a bit of a broader role of system architecture for autonomous vehicles. I still specialize in the fields I sort of am more comfortable with and I come from, which is MEMS. These MEMS IMUs are a core design technology for Analog Devices, and they go into a lot of autonomous systems. Over the last year, definitely my role has expanded to understand and go deeper into the interaction between multiple different sensors as part of autonomous vehicles. So with that, I think we can kick off the introduction for the topic of the day, which is self-driving cars. And funnily enough, I came across this quote on my Instagram today, which was a friend was driving behind a car, looks like, and car gave an indicator for the right and turned left. Very, very common behavior. I've seen this in Pune and in Boston all the time. So what are some of the motivations behind developing this self-driving technology? So self-driving vehicles are primarily targeted towards improving safety for human actions on the road. So motor vehicle accidents are in fact the 11th leading cause of death across the globe, according to some studies. And there is unfortunately a disproportionate amount of burden which is lifted by low and middle income countries as part of these as part of the global total. And this motor vehicle accidents impact the younger or the first half century of our age group population much more disproportionately, in the sense that typically as people grow older, they start dying more often of natural causes such as cancer and heart attacks and so on. But if you look at the younger age group between 15 and 44 years old, motor vehicle accidents are actually the second leading cause of death, and we have only, as this plot shows, they've only gotten to the second spot due to poisoning, which is drug overdoses in the US, to a major epidemic at this point. But motor vehicle accidents, as you can see, they have diminished in number over the years, but they haven't completely, it's still like a pretty significant number as of like 2019. I'm sure all totals from 2020 are completely skewed due to COVID. But most of these motor vehicle accidents look like they're completely preventable because they are due to human error rather than being in a situation where nobody could control the car. The other reason for self-driving vehicles is efficiency on multiple fronts. So today our urban infrastructure is planned around the idea that people have to use individual cars for getting in and around cities. And that leads to a lot of inefficient use of space and time. So there are these giant parking structures in the middle of the city occupying prime real estate. There are the countless numbers of productive hours lost in commutes every day. Again, not applicable during work from home, but we sort of maybe remember what life was like in 2019. And all of the fuel that gets wasted to sitting in traffic during congestion. There are models that show that human behavior drives traffic jams much more than volume of traffic itself. So there are like multiple efficiency-based reasons as well for driving this self-driving revolution. But sorry. Oh. Definitely the most important aspect here is safety, and that has been the driving point behind this technology revolution. So when it comes to autonomy and self-driving, these terms are used interchangeably in layman's language, but perhaps in industry, we make a slight distinction between these. So self-driving is typically considered the type of technology or the type of functionality which allows human beings to not use their hands and feet while driving a vehicle. So that would be that would essentially mean that the car is able to remain within its lane and brake and accelerate as per traffic surrounding it. So that is really the first couple of levels of autonomy, and that will maybe level 2 as shown on this diagram. But what we are moving towards steadily is full or high automation, and that includes human drivers not having to look at the road at all, or even being able to be asleep or fully engrossed in some other task while the car essentially drives itself. And that is what we really call as autonomous driving, where the car is making decisions for itself based on more than just detecting whether it is remaining within the lane or whether it's not, making sure it's not crashing into any other vehicles. And we can definitely go into more details of this chart if people are interested later. But for now, I'm just going to say that we are roughly at the level 2 to 3 of autonomy at this point. The most visible example probably is Tesla. And maybe Waymo. Again, robotaxis versus personally owned vehicles lie on different, along different points on this chart. So we can definitely discuss more details later if people are interested. So what exactly is the reason behind cars not being able to drive themselves? I mean, it seems obvious that a human driver mostly needs to make all decisions regarding driving on their own, but typically all of the challenges regarding driving or the tasks that are executed while driving can be broken down into 2 areas. So one is perception and the other is navigation. And I'm going to spend the next several minutes talking about these 2 areas. At this point, I am at a good point in the talk where I'm going to look at some the question I have on the chat. So about LiDAR and other acronyms, yes, absolutely. So we are going to talk about those in more detail, but specifically with respect to LiDAR, it is LiDAR just stands for light detection and ranging. It is an acronym sort of very similar to radar, if you've heard of that one, which is radio detection and ranging, but that by itself will probably not mean anything to you. So we are definitely going to go into that in the perception category. So, so when it comes to self-driving vehicles, or even with any kind of autonomous navigation, what is the perception problem to begin with? So perception essentially means, can you perceive what is going on in your environment? The reason you do that is to detect and avoid obstacles around you. So that means that if I'm driving in an urban environment, I do not want to crash into pedestrians, cyclists, young and old people walking around me. It might be vehicles of all sizes, two-wheelers, buses, like there are countless obstacles on the road, and you don't want to crash into anyone. The other part of this is obviously understanding road signs. This may not be such a big deal in India, perhaps. I mean, we do have road signs indicating names of roads as well as like general directions and distances. But within the US, for example, you would also have like stop signs and yield signs and generally like a bunch of different signage on the road, which is supposed to influence driver behavior. So the goal of the perception system within a vehicle is to image, which is to take photographs or otherwise of objects in the environment, and then to detect and classify those objects. Like it's not just enough to detect that there is a large object here and say that I won't be crashing into this object. But if it's like a road sign, you also want to understand what the sign is trying to tell you and respond accordingly. And when it comes to the environments in which these autonomous vehicles drive themselves, if you focus on cars or like motor vehicles to begin with, you can immediately sort of classify the two the overall environments in which they drive into two categories maybe. So one is sort of this highway driving and the other is urban driving. So even with the most prominent example of self-driving cars, such as Tesla or Waymo, you can see that they have specialized in one of the two environments. So Teslas, for example, have a lot of their self-driving features and abilities to function up to the L2, L3 level of autonomy on highways primarily. So on highways, typically the speeds are fairly high. And that means that if there are even any smaller obstacles in the road, like tires, for example, like pieces of tire that get left behind after accidents or other road debris, you want to be able to avoid that because they can cause relatively high damage to your vehicle because of that high speed. So the typical speeds on these highways are something like 65 miles an hour on US highways. I believe in India they're like 100 kilometers an hour, and you want to be able to detect something about 150 meters out. Those specifications are really not set in stone yet. I'm seeing a question here. I'm going to address it as we come to the LiDAR portion of this. In urban areas, on the other hand, you have slower speed, but lots of unexpected movement. Like you can have people sort of changing their mind, getting in your way, not really like watching where they're going, being on their cell phone while they're driving, and so on and so forth. So generally, while the speeds are lower, the amount of perception that you have to do, or that 360-degree type of view might become more important. Perception technologies in terms of vehicle perception, at this point, there are primarily three different technologies: cameras, LiDAR, and radar, which are dominating the market. Within these as well, cameras and radar are the most key technologies, with LiDAR sort of being on the upswing still. There are multiple other technologies which are also being used, such as ultrasound or infrared or time-of-flight cameras. But those are used in relatively specific circumstances, such as parking assist or trying to navigate in indoor environments. So I'm not going to go into those in too much detail in the interest of time, but I'm happy to answer questions about those later. The reason you need more than one technology to address this problem of perception is that no single technology is able to give you good performance across all performance metrics. So the major challenges here remain something like, I want to measure distance. Then once I measure distance, I want to see what size of object it is. So I have some idea of what kind of object it might be. Then I want to know how fast that object is moving, which is velocity measurement. Then darkness and weather are both characters of the environment which can affect sensor availability. Like a simple example being cameras, which are passive sensors, don't work in the dark. And then object classification basically means, am I getting enough information about the object in order to be able to figure out what object this is? And finally, there is the spoofing problem, which is, am I mistaking other objects for the objects I'm trying to find? So if I have, I don't know, like a football shaped like a stop sign, or if I have a car with bicycles painted on it, am I going to mistake it for something else? Like, am I going to mistake the football for a stop sign, or am I going to mistake the car for a bicycle and make very wrong inferences and behavioral predictions about its future? So in a typical car today, there are multiple different sensors which are already deployed. And some of these sensors on this model diagram here are sort of the predicted sensor placements and predicted use of those sensors. So as you can see, most of the sensors used today are radar and camera based. They're used for a variety of different things. Like radars are primarily used for figuring out if there are large vehicles, specifically cars. So your blind spot detection, if any of you have that in your personal automotive. You can see that the blind spot detection technology, or while you're backing in and out of parking spots, if you have any parking assistance technology, that is typically based on radar systems. Either long or medium range radars. And they are also used very typically for adaptive cruise control. The advantage with these systems is that they're relatively cheap and they don't require as much processing. But certainly in order to detect any objects which are beyond the radar range and or ultrasound range, that ultrasound as well as time of flight is also used sometimes for the similar detection. But in order to find any objects beyond that point, you definitely need cameras. Specifically when it comes to road sign recognition, there is simply no alternative for them. And finally, where LiDAR might come in and probably comes in at a later stage is looking out at long distances beyond your vehicle, but in the direction of vehicle movement, to detect small objects that you might encounter like after a period of time. So let's start talking about some like these three technologies that I mentioned. So cameras, radar, and LiDAR. So cameras typically require you to first take images, as you can imagine, and then some amount of image processing and classification needs to happen, as I explained earlier. The biggest problem with cameras in general is that it is a passive sensor, which means that if you have solar glare, low light conditions, fog, rain, snow, everything sort of affects your camera performance. You can also get random debris or leaves or whatever simply blocking your sensor. It is a relatively small aperture size. So one big problem with relying on a single sensor like a camera, if that is the way you were trying to design your system, would be that it would simply not be robust enough. Some of the problems associated with cameras, such as lack of depth perception, can be fixed using stereo cameras. So stereo cameras work very, very similar to our eyes. So with these two pictures taken on the top right of the page here, you can see that I guess the giant tree on the right-hand side is missing in the right-hand side image. And when cameras are taking images from slightly different angles, you can judge that if an object moves a whole lot, it is probably pretty close to you. And basically, it's a parallax measurement that you're doing. And if the object is farther away, it's going to move very, very little between the two frames. And that gives you a pretty good idea of how far these things might be. Typical uses, as I mentioned, for cameras are these lane detection type of uses, as well as reading road signs and understanding them, as well as scene understanding. So if I can predict that, or rather if I can detect that there is a bicycle here and people talking there, and their body language indicates that they might cross the road, I can really use that information to make predictions about my own driving behavior in the future. Or control my driving behavior in the future. When it comes to areas like, when it comes to other sensors like radar has been deployed for a long time at this point now, mostly because, as I said, cameras are not adequate, and they also require a huge amount of processing to make that information useful to people or to cars, which the car processor. So radar is essentially, if you know how ultrasound works, radar essentially works like that in the simplest way. So by itself, like the physics can be quite complicated, but I'm going to explain the simplest way in which it could work. And that is the bottom left diagram here, where you can transmit a pulse, and that radar pulse gets reflected off of solid objects in the environment, and it can be received back at you over a different after a period of time. And if you can calculate that time of flight of how long did it take for that pulse to get back to me, you can estimate how far away a particular object is. The major advantage of using radar is that you generally have it is typically like pretty weather agnostic. So it doesn't matter if you're driving in a snowstorm or rainstorm or whatever, your radar function typically still works, which means you can continue using your adaptive cruise control or automated braking systems, regardless of what weather patterns are going on around you. And this maybe isn't the biggest problem in Pune, but it is a huge problem in Boston, where we see all 4 seasons, and visibility can be very, very low sometimes. Typical uses are, as I mentioned, all of these like lane change assist or radar, blind spot detection, and so on and so forth. The top diagram here, in fact, comes from a LiDAR company, but funnily enough, almost all of the major components they have detected, the major obstacles they have detected, can be detected by radar as well. And finally, we come to LiDAR, which is the youngest and newest technology. So the difference between cameras, radar, and LiDAR, as you might have noticed, is really a question of wavelength. Right? Like radar wavelengths are in the few millimeters. Visible wavelengths for cameras are typically in the 400 to 700 nanometers type of region of the spectrum. And LiDAR is basically it's in the infrared area, so it is 800 to 1500 type of nanometers. There are obviously very specific frequencies which are used, and LiDAR works very similarly to the principle I explained before for radar, which is you have a very narrow beam of laser light which is shown out at vehicles, and then you measure the time of flight using a detector. Typically, you get far better resolution with LiDAR. Radar antennas typically create these antenna patterns, and these are these like big blobs of beams. And resolution is also dependent on the wavelength itself that is used using the Rayleigh criterion. But typically that all of this boils down to LiDAR giving you a better resolution for stuff like I had mentioned before, this debris lying on the road. And that is a classic problem that LiDAR companies are trying to solve today. The problem a little bit with LiDAR is that it has some of the advantages of cameras and radar and some of the disadvantages of both, the wavelengths lying in the middle. So LiDAR is definitely something which is affected by weather, but similar to cameras that can detect these very small objects. The cost itself, though, is highest for LiDAR systems at this point, and commercial LiDAR systems which are deployed on some of these robo-taxis, they can cost in the thousands of dollars. Like last I checked, it was like a couple of $1,000 at least, but they are continuously trying to bring those numbers down. Overall, it's just kind of expensive to work with these materials which can allow you to go up to, let's say, 1500 nanometer wavelengths and so on. I can discuss LiDAR in more detail. I'm really trying not to because I worked on it for a couple of years. Probably in the interest of time, I might skip this slide right now, but I will say that to go into a little bit of detail regarding how exactly the technology can work. You have multiple ways of getting laser light out of a laser and then scanning it. So the technology I was working on primarily was scanning technology, and there are so many alternatives even within scanning for LiDAR. You have similar alternatives for lasers, which are creating the light that gets transmitted, and alternatives for diodes and detection systems. But the main differentiation between various technologies at this point might be the scanning part itself. So Velodyne LiDAR systems, which are the top right, they are kind of pretty small. They fit into the palm of your hand, the rightmost ones. Those are the ones I was talking about, which still cost a couple of $1,000s. But those mainly rely on mechanical beam steering elements. So there is literally a motor inside of it, which is like rapidly spinning the system around to scan, to basically have this laser point to various areas of the environment. On the other hand, you could also have like mechanical mirrors as shown on the bottom right. So you have a mechanical mirror which is rapidly moving to deflect this laser beam towards multiple, through various angles. And finally, the thing that I was working on in the middle of the page there was this beam steering element. It was an optoelectrical beam steering element. So it was voltage controlled. And the voltage essentially changed the liquid crystal refractive index. So you could get your beam to steer in a variety of angles in the longitudinal direction and also in the lateral direction. So I guess it depends on how you are defining lateral and longitudinal, but for up and sideways directions. Finally, you can also do a similar thing through optical phased arrays, which I think is like way too much physics for the scope of this talk. At this point, I'm going to look at a couple of questions which I have here. So time difference between object being detected and action like braking being taken. So so this is a very good question about, essentially the question about, I guess these are, yeah, these questions are given to everyone. So, or sent to everyone. So yeah, so typically the problem with designing a perception system is that you don't want to brake unnecessarily. That basically means that you don't want to react to false positives. And it essentially means that if I'm trying to detect road debris, or if I detect a brick in the road, or if I detect something that might cause an accident, I want to be sure uh, that I have detected that in fact, and my system hasn't just picked up some random noise and flagged that as an obstacle with me. So that's why, like, the major challenge here is getting multiple frames of that object where that object is detected, or having a sufficiently high confidence level of that detection before you react to it. And then braking itself for a vehicle, if you're at 65 miles per hour and you're trying to brake at a typical braking speed, I believe, are somewhere between 3 and 4 meters per second square for a vehicle. And I think that works out to about 6 to 7 seconds on a freeway. So from that is how you do the math. Like, you figure out that if I know right now that I can brake, and I'm going to take like 6 or 7 seconds, and I travel more than 100 meters during that time. That is basically the amount of, that's basically the range I need for at least some of my systems to be able to detect this debris in the road. So if I can't detect something which is more than 100 meters out, so let's say I need to detect something which is 150 meters out, so that by the time I get to 125 meters from it or 100 meters from it, I have detected it and definitely confirmed that this thing exists and started slowing down accordingly. Otherwise, I just don't have enough time in my system to do like a graceful braking procedure. So that is also very important. Like, the quality of the ride is also important when we think about these constraints. And the other question I saw about radar with respect to ideal range. So with respect to ideal ranges, I think on freeways, they expect you to have at least 3 to 4 car widths, car lengths in front of you while trailing the car. This can increase a little bit more when you are at high speeds on the freeway. So that is typically the range you need on the towards the front. And radar is more typically used in highway applications for automated cruise control as well as braking systems. On the side, it basically depends on lane width, and that's why in the initial diagram as well, you could see that the side radar as well as other detection systems like ultrasound, those have a fairly modest range. Like, it could be like 1 lane width or half a lane width or so. So I'm seeing some more questions here, but I'm going to move on for now and talk about some of the navigation challenges, and then maybe we can come back to all of these questions later. So the other portion of the other challenge when it comes to vehicle autonomy is navigation. And essentially it means that when I sit in my car today at my home, my car should be able to tell me exactly how to go from wherever I'm at, which is home, to I don't know, the place I want to go to for brunch. So essentially, it doesn't just need to calculate a map and a path that I need to take, but it also needs to navigate that on its own. So this problem can be broken down into 2 portions, 2 parts really. One is the global positioning problem, which is I have a current street address and a new street address, and how do I get there? That is with respect to cars. If you are on a farm instead, or if you're in a factory, these problems might be far more constrained on the global level, and maybe your entire problem is simply local. But then the other problem is more dynamic and in situ, which means while you are navigating, do you really need that global position? Probably not. Could help. It really depends though. It depends on what kind of accuracy you want in your positioning and what sensors are available. Like, sometimes GPS may or may not be available. And we're going to go into that as to what are the challenges with respect to various sensors when it comes to navigating. As we said, the environments that you are functioning in matter quite a bit. Outdoor environments typically have sensors like GPS, which is the most commonly used for global positioning. They are available more often than not, but there is typically more environmental noise, or there could be more dynamics, just more objects in the environment, which cause multi-path reflections, or which cause various errors essentially in these sensors. On the other hand, for indoor environments, it might be a little bit easier to navigate because it is easier to navigate because the environment is far more predictable. But on the other hand, certain sensors like GPS are typically just not available in those situations. So here is a top level view of what navigation technologies are typically used. And you all must have heard of GPS, also more generically known as GNSS. GPS, as you all might know, is the US acronym for the system, and there is a separate one by the EU and a separate one in Russia and in China and so on and so forth. Then we are going to talk a little bit about that and Wi-Fi based systems on which can serve as a complement to GPS for indoor uses, because as I said, GPS is typically not available whenever you don't have direct line of sight to satellites. I'm also going to talk about perception-based navigation and IMUs, or inertial measurement units. So both of those can be used for either indoor or outdoor navigation. And then there are many other types of positioning technologies. You can use wheel dynamics, for example. You can, which essentially means that you can count the number of rotations, or you can count the speed of the wheel to figure out roughly how far you have traveled. Or you can use these beacons or transponder-based systems. They can be used specifically when you have like a single track, like a railroad, and you're trying to understand your position along them. But I'm not really going to go into too many details of those, because even though they do enable autonomy to an extent, they are not quite as generically applicable as some of the others. And similar to perception technologies, the major challenges for navigation technologies are once again range and resolution. In this case, the range is about whether you're in the range of the sensor itself, or how far you can travel before the sensor gives you large errors. And resolution essentially means what is the accuracy, like how accurately is this positioning system positioning me on a map and telling me about my orientation or my velocity. And finally, availability, as I mentioned before with GPS and indoor environments, is always a challenge. Like with most of these sensors, you need to be within line of sight, so in order to position yourself. So I'm going to go over just a couple of positioning principles which are common to GPS as well as Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and other indoor positioning systems. So very typically, like how do you even position yourself using GPS? And maybe some of you already know this, but I can see that some of you have some background in GPS here, like RTK. But essentially what GPS does is it triangulates, right? Like every satellite is constantly transmitting its location along with a time of transmission. And so you can always calculate the circle. This is the problem has been boiled down to 2D for this diagram, but you can always calculate a circle. So if you take a certain amount of, if the message takes a certain amount of time to go from the GPS satellite or a cell phone tower to the mobile carrier, then you know how far you are from that particular satellite or from that particular tower. And as long as you construct these three intersecting circles for a two-dimensional system, you can always tell where you are located based on that. So this is this time of arrival concept. The other thing you can do, more commonly done in indoor systems, is either proximity or scene analysis. So that means that if you have known locations of routers or like a dense grid of beacons, you could simply mark yourself as being close to one specific beacon, giving you the strongest signal on the receiver end. The scene analysis portion is a little bit more involved, where you look at individual signatures of the power that you're receiving from different base stations, and using that you sort of do an interpolation, but that usually requires some amount of machine learning to calculate exactly where your location is with respect to a bunch of known locations on the grid. So that was definitely very high level. I did not want to go into maybe too much of the physics, like anything beyond that, we have to go take a deeper dive into the math and the physics of the problem. But to give you an overview of the technologies themselves, so as we mentioned before, GPS is the most commonly used, and it is used primarily in outdoor situations in a global, which gives you a global position. And it is typically pretty low precision, like it gives you like a 1 to 2 meter precision. And I see this, I saw this question here earlier about RTK mode. So yes, there is the real-time kinematic corrections that can be applied to GPS receivers and the signals you get from them. And essentially, GPS signals can have this 1 to 2 meter error because of atmospheric, not exactly losses, but delays. And you can overcome, so these delays happen due to whatever, like changes in refractive index of the atmosphere through which your satellite signal is coming to you. And typically they can be estimated and somewhat mitigated by doing multiple bands of reception. So if you have a dual channel GPS receiver, for example, it is literally looking at 2 different frequencies, and using those 2 frequencies, it can sometimes calculate what is the loss or what is the time delay due to the atmosphere, and calculate a more accurate position for the satellite distance according to that. What RTK measurements, PPP, as well as like some of the other GPS augmentation does is there are usually base stations on the ground which are positioned closer to you, which are in real time calculating, like, so the base station position is known down to whatever degree of accuracy, like down to centimeters, let's say. At least the antenna position is known. And the GPS satellite position is also known to that kind of accuracy. So the base station then estimates those delays from the atmosphere for you, and it can do it across a wider range of frequencies. You can use multiple different base stations, and that is how the precision of GPS can be improved quite significantly. So you can go down to like the decimeter level. So I think it typically goes down to tens of centimeters, or maybe down to 10 centimeter type of levels. But it is, or rather it could be a paid service, and it's also not very widely available everywhere. The biggest challenges to GPS, even where it is available, is this line of sight problem. So if you're inside a parking garage, if you're inside a tunnel, urban canyons, very typically you lose either all or a few satellites, and that compromises your positioning accuracy in the other direction. And GPS, as I mentioned, can be augmented by various means, either by these base stations, or you can even augment it using Wi-Fi in a very similar manner. And that brings us to Wi-Fi. So because we can't use GPS for many indoor applications that could be inside warehouses, inside mines, or inside construction zones sometimes, you could instead rely on Wi-Fi for that. And the idea behind using Wi-Fi, or for that matter, cellular or ultra-wideband localization services in indoor, mostly indoor, but also applicable to outdoor environments, is that you can set up these routers yourself. So you typically, the range of Wi-Fi tends to be like 100 meters type of thing in open air. Ultra wideband has a slightly longer range than that. So you have typically Wi-Fi is also blocked by walls in a house. So you either need like multiple routers or repeaters to get that signal strength back. But regardless, you can position yourself, like you can imagine an indoor robot positioning itself with respect to these Wi-Fi routers, or like either the dense grid of routers or independent Wi-Fi routers, which are fewer in number, and look at relative signal strength. So one of the problems with doing something like this is the accuracy once again. So if you have this, if you simply position by proximity, you are only going to know, oh, am I closer to router 1 or router 2, which gives you a very like crude measurement of roughly where I might be. If you start doing ranging though, which is the base station or the base router sends a signal to the mobile carrier, and the mobile carrier can also send signals to the base router, then you can calculate like how long it takes, which is like time of flight type of calculations. For these things to happen, and then you get a far better accuracy through them. But typically that requires just multiple measurements to be averaged, and that takes longer time to get that better accuracy. One big challenge with using something like Wi-Fi or Bluetooth is that there is a handset to handset difference. So on the right-hand side, you can see that the top diagram and the bottom diagram are, so the top diagram has two different routers, left and right, and the same two routers show very different signal strength for a different handset on the bottom figure. So you kind of have to calibrate this for independent handsets. And the other problem sometimes is that Wi-Fi nodes, if they are not set up by you, and instead you are using them in an urban environment to navigate around a city landscape, for example, you could absolutely have your nodes move around between mapping and measurement. So that means that you drove around, you mapped all the locations of your Wi-Fi points and the relative signal strengths, and the next time you went there with your autonomous vehicle, the nodes aren't there anymore. And so you get like that error from simply not having access to information that was there before, because they are all like privately owned essentially. So a couple of other systems that have started gaining, or sensors which have started gaining more prominence over the last few years here are these perception-based systems and IMUs that I'm going to talk about next. So perception-based navigation essentially uses camera images to extract position and orientation. So you can compare. So what that basically means is, okay, I already have these cameras on my vehicle, or I have LiDAR sensors on my vehicle, which are going to help me detect obstacles. But can I also use it to image the static environment and like use the relative motion of that static environment with respect to the motion of the vehicle itself to figure out how quickly the vehicle must be moving or how quickly it must be turning. And this requires quite a bit of heavy processing on the computer vision side. So for example, in this diagram, you can see like the top and bottom frames are taken at two different time epochs. And you can do like a feature match between what you're seeing in one frame versus the other frame, and look at like you have to do some coordinate transformations and figure out exactly how much you might have rotated or moved in order to give you that kind of movement of objects within the frame. And as you can see, this is complicated. This takes a while, and it usually also adds delay. Like basically, it means that after I have already captured frame 1 and frame 2, I need some time to just process this information. And so this is a very good way of calculating, or rather it is a robust way. It can be a robust way of calculating your position and orientation, but it just takes a bit of time, and hence it is not a very responsive system. The other problems that the system could run into is the problem of scale, which is where if you don't have enough features and you don't know how big they are or how far they are, you can't always figure out like exactly how far you are from them, and hence calculate your position accordingly. The other problem could be simply not having features in the environment. Like you could be driving through a very long tunnel and there is nothing your camera can hook onto as specific features that it is now tracking. So it doesn't come without its own challenges. Finally, IMUs. So IMUs stand for inertial measurement units, and so an inertial measurement unit is a combination of an accelerometer and a gyroscope. Accelerometers, as you all know, they measure acceleration. Gyroscopes measure angular velocity along multiple directions. So these micro electromechanical devices typically. So IMUs by themselves can also work on non-MEMS principles, but the ones that are affordable to put in vehicles are typically MEMS-based. And they help you calculate the relative position of your vehicle or the relative orientation of your vehicle based on, as compared to where you started off. So that essentially means that if I'm, so these are the same devices, for example, which let your phone know that like when you're looking at something like, you know, with the phone screen vertical, and when you turn it to horizontal, these are the same devices that let your phone detect that that orientation change has happened and rotate your screen accordingly. So just to give you like sort of a real life connection to what these IMUs or accelerometers or gyroscopes are. Similarly, if you have any wearable devices like Fitbits or whatever heart rate, I don't know, like footstep monitors, those will use accelerometers typically. So regardless, these are very small devices. They can sit inside a vehicle and they are fairly immune to any external attacks. So they are not really at risk from spoofing type of attacks. But the challenges with them are that they typically have drifts in the longer term. So you can only really rely on them for a few seconds at a time, and then their error just like grows beyond. I mean, the error keeps growing continuously, but at some point it grows beyond your tolerances. And there is a cost performance trade-off. Like if you're willing to pay more money, then they can go on for a longer time without drift. But then you're a car manufacturer and a car customer. You can't, you don't want to spend like $2,000 on an IMU, which is just going to be part of the system. So that's one of the challenges when it comes to IMUs. And finally, even though this talk does not touch upon any of these other trends at all, I wanted to put out there that vehicle to vehicle or vehicle to infrastructure communications are other, as well as electrification, obviously. These are major trends in the automotive industry right now. And the V2V or generally V2X communication and the security protocols regarding that, the communication channels, etc. These are all active areas of interest, and they are definitely a big part of how traffic congestion can be reduced or more efficient routes can be mapped out for these automotive, for these self-driving autonomous vehicles. And at this point, I'm going to see if there are a couple of questions I can answer. Maybe the most, I'm trying to see which can be answered in the shortest amount of time right now. Okay, so how will self-driving vehicles, maybe we can talk about this one. How will self-driving vehicles react to the vehicles driving, especially behind them, driven by humans in a situation when self-driven vehicle would brake to stop and vehicle behind it, given by a human, does not stop or comes close to the self-driven car? So typically this, when I think about this question, people ask these questions all the time, like what would happen if it is not my fault, essentially, as a human driver, but somebody else comes and crashes into me? And the answer to that, unfortunately, is that self-driving cars are going to help you with any errors that you might make in your driving. They can't stop other bad actors on the street from doing whatever it is that they're doing, unless that car is also being driven autonomously. But essentially, when we talk about reducing the number of fatalities, accidents due to motor vehicles by use of autonomous technology, we are talking about preventable accidents, and we are talking about accidents in which accidents which are in fact caused by human errors. As you saw, something like 5 to 6% of accidents are not caused by human error. Maybe somebody's tire bursts. Maybe, I don't know, there's like somebody's seatbelt fails, like somebody's airbag deploys without reason while they're driving. So those are problems that autonomy is not going to solve for you, because a human being could also not solve those problems. Or at least we are not there yet. Hopefully in the future we can figure out what, I'm sure cars will at some point be intelligent enough to figure out that, oh, okay, maybe the car behind me is not intending to brake before crashing into me. So maybe if there is room on the shoulder of the road or in the neighboring lane, I'm just going to move myself. So you could definitely execute some defensive behaviors in that sense. Okay, so I think I'm going to move on at this point, and I'll definitely come back to other questions later. So in terms of applications and social impact of autonomous technologies, the primary market that most manufacturers are targeting are absolutely road vehicles. But road vehicles themselves come into many different categories. So there are the personally owned vehicles, robo-taxis, there are these long-haul trucks, and each category of vehicle, as you have seen throughout the theme of this talk, is that everything comes with its own set of challenges. A personally owned vehicle, for example, means it comes with a set of cost challenges, because typically individual drivers are not willing to pay huge premiums for autonomy. I mean, we all want the latest features in our cars, but we aren't willing to pay like $10,000 extra for the vehicle manufacturer to put those in there. Whereas when it comes to something like a robo-taxi, where that cost is divided among multiple users or customers, you can easily imagine the cost of the car being jacked up by $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, and it's still being a viable business proposition. The other example of these long haul trucks is where there are these very, very thankless jobs in industry sometimes, like when it comes to delivering goods from one city to another, sometimes with very long trucking distances, they could be in multiple days or at least several hours at a time. And that multiple accidents in those cases result from worker fatigue or overexertion. And it really, really is a thankless job as well. So this is one of the places where on-road autonomy is being tested to quite a large extent right now in the US. And it is a problem which I believe can be easily solved because it is a fixed environment. It's a highway environment. It is a very fixed speed. You don't need to have a super suite of sensors to look for every single obstacle that could possibly arise. Mostly these trucks are driving through on these freeways with very few vehicles which are not straight up cars or maybe two-wheelers occasionally. But the biggest social impact and advantage here is definitely in terms of improved rider safety and decreased motor vehicle accidents. The other, so the other, one of the other applications for self-driven vehicles or autonomous vehicles are industrial and agricultural applications. So in industrial cases such as mining or construction sites, there's often a need for completing tasks which are dangerous for human beings to do, or sometimes it requires human beings to drive long distances, walk long distances. It could be over uneven terrain, etc. So that is something that can be easily outsourced to an autonomous robot in this particular case. One thing I was thinking of was also this recent Mars landing that happened with Perseverance. For any kind of extraterrestrial applications where communication links remain a problem, you have to rely on some level of vehicle autonomy to complete tasks. Otherwise, you would basically spend 16 minutes just waiting at a very minimum, 16 minutes just waiting for communication to happen between whatever Earth and Mars. And as a result, your car would never move anywhere. It absolutely has to be able to do some amount of mapping and localization on its own. The other area that is an area of active use of some levels of autonomy is precision agriculture. And in this case, I don't know how many of you have heard of this already, but on these larger scale industrial farms, there are these agricultural robots which can dispense seed as well as fertilizer in a very, very precise manner. Like this is down to centimeter level accuracy, and it helps you dispense those chemicals in extremely small quantities at the correct point, depending on which plant you have encountered. That the plants themselves are identified using the combination of computer vision techniques and other perception technologies. And the key challenges in this kind of environment are definitely the precision as well as the positioning technologies. But the huge advantage there is high throughputs or making agriculture greener, as well as in mining and construction sites, it's essentially increased worker safety. Drones are again one of those hot topics in engineering overall, and during COVID or during natural disasters of any kind, these can be thought of as these fast, inexpensive delivery services to either remote areas or rural areas, and especially during the pandemic, they are extremely good for contactless delivery as well. When it comes to drones, the big challenge is always cost and size, weight, and power, because you now have to make something go airborne and not have to keep charging it over and over again. So as compared to everything else for drones, maybe positioning does not have to be quite as accurate while this drone is flying around, because our airspace is luckily not as crowded yet as our roads are. And finally, with warehouse robots, these are most useful for preventing injuries or repetitive tasks that are carried out by workers in these warehouses. And some robots are definitely more like delivery bots, which go from one place to another. But other types of autonomy might simply involve like a robot identifying a location or a package at a particular location and then taking it fairly close to itself. Big challenge in this case is usually the co-location with human beings. So you want to be very, very precise because human beings can be working in very close proximity with these robots. And the other, as always, is cost and being able to function in an indoor environment where you have to deploy your own sensors a whole lot of times. And finally, coming to the social impact portion of this, it is this mobility and public transport aspect of autonomous technology, which is gaining a lot of traction in recent days. So I spoke earlier about safety and efficiency as the drivers for autonomy. But what is maybe an incidental impact of autonomy is equity, which is being able to serve as mobility devices or transport devices for individuals who cannot drive. So these can be disabled individuals, or they can be children, or the increasing numbers of elderly population around the entire world, which does not have public transport or even private transport systems at inexpensive rates catering to them. The other problem always arises around public transport systems is those of access to remote areas. So as with every public transport system around the world, practically, these systems rarely run at profits. In fact, they mostly run at losses, and they especially run at losses when it comes to low use routes. Those routes are typically far-flung or remote areas which still need to be connected somehow to major city centers. But there are there's very, very low traffic, and hence no profits to be made there. So you can easily imagine replacing those routes with these autonomous vehicles. And in fact, this has already started in Japan or in France with these specific corporations. And this can be practically a game changer for access to these areas. And I think this is all I have for you today. I'm happy to take any questions beyond this point. So thank you.
Thanks, Radhika. Maybe if you can cover any open questions in the chat box.
Yeah, that sounds good. Great. Okay. All right. So let me go back to where I used to be, which is, okay. Where were we? Okay, so we talked about, okay, ideal range. Okay, which AI platforms are consumed for autonomous cars? I am not really sure what this means. I can tell you that typically the processors used are, NVIDIA is a pretty commonly used processor for processing the vast amounts of data that gets generated in real time. When it comes to simulation and testing out environments, there are several open source platforms like Carla, which are used. Then there are some open source data sets captured by driving around in real world conditions. Nutonomy has made their data set available to everyone. I believe there are some that you can purchase as well. So there is a lot out there. There are practically every single simulation tool like ANSYS, COMSOL, MSC Hexagon, they have their own versions of self-driving cars and or other self-driving simulations. They will have all sorts of driving environment variables, like you can simulate foggy and high sunlight and dark conditions, and you can put in your own radar and LiDAR and whatever other full sensor suite on the vehicle, and basically get a complete overview of how your system might function under those environments. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thanks, Radhika.
Okay, sure. The challenge in reducing LiDAR costs. This is definitely a technical challenge. So the thing with LiDAR costs is that LiDAR technology currently is at 2 different wavelengths. And one of the reasons why it has taken so long to come to market is because there is no agreement on what that LiDAR system needs to provide to the vehicle system. So there are many different automotive manufacturers who all come to LiDAR manufacturers with a widely different set of specs in terms of resolution, in terms of range, and depending on which of those specs you follow, you can design your system very differently. So if you keep LiDAR systems at the 900 something nanometer range, it is relatively cheap to produce them. And that is because most of the infrastructure and the materials that are built, like you can simply use silicon-based infrastructure at that point. So it was already developed for telecom, and you can reuse a lot of those components. But the problem at 900 something nanometers is that the human eye, even though it cannot detect 900 nanometers, it is still susceptible to those. So that means that the maximum power you can output, and hence the maximum range that you can look out to, while still remaining above your SNR, is limited. The other thing is that solar background noise, basically just sunlight at that spectrum, is still fairly high in power, and that means that that also kills your SNR. So essentially what you need to do is move to the 1500 nanometer wavelength instead, where a lot of the technology for LiDAR is not developed. So you don't, the lasers are somewhat developed, but not completely. You have detectors which are indium gallium arsenide, in gas for the most part, but they aren't, they're fairly expensive, and people are doing some research into alternative materials, but those haven't commercialized into products yet. And finally, the scanning technologies themselves, like it is not cheap to build a robust mechanical scanner or a robust like liquid crystal based waveguide, simply because for the kind of precision we are talking about, like I can talk about a liquid crystal waveguide, right? Like for coupling light into a waveguide, you need to be something like 0.1 degrees precise. So it is just a very challenging engineering problem, and that basically means that you're going to lose a lot of yield or a lot of devices simply because they won't meet spec. So yes, the problem is essentially technical and manufacturing based. So this is an interesting question about the main reason for adopting autonomous driving being improved safety, and what if people want to opt out of it and want to have self-agency, and how do I see USA in 10 years from now and 25 years on now? So yeah, this is definitely a very interesting question. I have heard, funnily enough, several people within my own company who work on autonomous driving saying that they don't want autonomous cars. I think the answer to this question is maybe part of it is socio-psychological, and part of it is practical and regulatory. So I would say that how many of you really felt like if you did not know anything about automated braking systems or lane keeping systems, and somebody told you that they were going to introduce that into their cars, maybe you would have said that, oh, I don't need this, I can drive myself, thank you very much. Like I know some people who don't even like who prefer stick shift driving over regular, like non-gear driving, like we have like fully automatic cars like we have here, right? And there are always going to be those people who genuinely like the idea of driving, and maybe they won't opt into the whole autonomous experience, and that is totally fine. With any technology, there are I believe there are these like multiple different groups of people who adopt at different stages of the technology. There are like the super early adopters, then there are the followers, then there is sort of this like mainstream. At some point, the technology just becomes mainstream and more people adopt it. And then there are like the laggers who sort of just never adopt it. And there is nothing wrong with it, absolutely. Like self-driving cars or autonomous technology at no point assumes that a majority of the drivers on the road are going to be autonomous. It does say though that if more and more cars become autonomous, the overall traffic management system becomes a lot more efficient. So it becomes more of a policy and regulatory problem at that point as compared to an agency problem. And you can also see that several features which have improved safety over the past several years, such as seat belts, initially were touted as optional and adopted primarily by users who were doing it for their personal safety and out of personal agency. But at some point, it just becomes mandated by governments as well. And it becomes the norm rather than a choice that you make. I think we sort of answered this question on RTK, but yes, you can use GPS with RTK for localization. Can we trust the readings fully, or do we also need to use SLAM in an urban environment? So the challenges with an urban environment are a little bit unique with respect to GPS. So if you look at any urban environment, any basic picture of an urban environment, what happens is you still get to see satellites, but you just don't get to see them across the full hemisphere that you typically need to see satellites in for localization. So typically, if your car is driving along a straight road in New York City, let's say, or something very similar to that, like in downtown Shanghai or whatever, that it means that you can see satellites which are above you, and then you can see satellites which are in front of you and behind you, like along that line of road, but you don't see anything on the two sides. That typically means that you get a very good position accuracy front to back, but you don't get good accuracy side to side. And that is why you still need some other version of SLAM, as you call it, which is simultaneous localization and mapping in that kind of urban environment. So yes, you can rely on satellites, but GPS also relies on being able to see satellites in multiple different directions to reduce errors along different axes. Miscalculation of distance due to radar reflections. So yes, so this generally can happen, but typically you would never make any assertions based on a single reading, and neither would you make those assertions as far as possible based on a single sensor. So in general, what you're saying is yes, multipath reflections is a problem, and you can absolutely get false detections because of any and all sensors that I've talked about. But typically, in order to mitigate those concerns, you use the concept of sensor fusion, which means that you look at multiple different sensors and you verify that the information you're receiving and the inferences you're making from that information are consistent across all these sensors. And that allows you to somewhat mitigate these concerns regarding any predictions you're making, not just about distance, but about user behavior, about objects in the environment, about positioning, so on and so forth. In the context of navigation, does autonomous car interact with and benefit from external infrastructure? So yes, so this is absolutely true. It can, and they have done some initial experiments on this. So Analog Devices has a collaboration with MCT, and so do many other companies. You can join in for a small fee. But so MCT is also perhaps not completely unique in what it offers. So it is essentially a very small, it is an autonomous autonomous vehicle collaboration or collaborative group maybe that is based at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, but it is industry supported. So what industry partners get out of it is a lot of data. They can also drive around on the self-driving track, which is located at University of Michigan. And the same MCT, along with several other parts, several other autonomous driving collaborations, have at this point deployed either fleets of vehicles or fleet of public transport buses, which do communicate with infrastructure or which do communicate with each other. And yes, they can absolutely do that. And there is a research underway to help understand traffic patterns or construction patterns, any messages that need to be passed regarding, I mean, I don't know, like especially poor road conditions in some places, poor weather conditions that can be coming up, or an accident that might have happened on the road, which suggests that you should take an alternative route to a place. So those are the various ways in which autonomous vehicles are expected to benefit from this external communication with infrastructure as well as other 5G connected vehicles. The other thing you can actually do from this is also mapping and positioning. So if you have some idea of the map and the surrounding environment that the other vehicle is seeing, and you're maybe like tailing it by a few meters or so, by the time you get there, you can maybe position yourself much more accurately with that updated sort of local map. And this is actually already done. It's not just an idea. It is done by, I believe, a fleet which operates out of China. So there are many interesting use cases there, but all of which rely on good security, access to cloud, and generally having some base number of vehicles in that fleet. So I think I already answered the next question about how they would vehicles would respond to mistakes made by other drivers. And can connected cars help avoid collisions or consequences or of sensor errors? I believe this was sort of answered before with respect to sensor fusion as well as some of these automated systems. But also with the caveat that you cannot fix other people's problems for the most part, at least not yet. So Tesla has refused to use LiDAR so far, and not just for cost reason. They rely heavily on vision and camera. What is your opinion? Is this the right strategy? So it is true that Tesla has not used LiDARs in their systems at this point. And Elon Musk does go on tweeting that he will never use LiDAR. That being said, this is not, from what I understand, the official position of the engineering division of Tesla. And they, for the most part, are waiting to have LiDAR systems come down in cost and up in reliability. Vision systems at this point, so Tesla does rely a lot on stereo vision systems. So vision systems typically can detect obstacles in the road and can detect many features in the environment just fine. But vision systems are also limited in terms of depth perception with increasing depth. So I believe the numbers are along the lines of 80 meters. And when your system is more, when your object or obstacle is more than 80 meters away, I think like essentially the uncertainty in depth increases as the depth itself increases. So if you have maybe like a 1 centimeter precision error when you have an object which is fairly close to you, like at 5 meters, so the stereo camera is very easily able to accurately position that object at 5 meters. But if the same object is at 80 meters away, it might have like a 1 meter position error uncertainty. So that is one of the challenges with stereo cameras that can potentially be solved using LiDAR. You have also seen several Tesla crashes that have happened recently, and you can see that while a lot of cars drive just fine without LiDAR, obviously, which are these Tesla cars, you can see that most robo-taxis do in fact use LiDAR, and we think that they are closer to the L3, L4 level of autonomy. So the answer to your question is that if you want to go up in autonomy levels, you almost certainly need LiDAR systems to be somewhere on your vehicle. But otherwise, what Tesla is offering is mostly something which can be done using camera and vision alone, which is essentially you wake the driver up or you expect them to be fully aware and ready to take over whenever the car can't figure out what to do. So what is electrification? So in one sentence, electrification means that you switch over from using oil and gas as fuel for your vehicle to using electricity. So Tesla, once again, is an example of this, but that's not the only example. There are lots of hybrid cars in the market at this point. There are several automotive manufacturers that want to move to fully electric vehicles in the future. And some of it is due to pollution, some of it is due to being able to reduce the size of the engine and considerably simplify the vehicle all of the electronic and mechanical parts that go into a vehicle. So if any of you have seen a Tesla, I know that it's not a common sight in India from what I understand, but the Tesla, if you open up the front hood, there is literally like more storage space there because the engine is so small and it's also like very quiet. So there are several advantages to have that.
Radhika, maybe considering the timelines,
Yeah.
maybe you can take 2-3 questions more maximum because there seems to be quite a lot, and maybe people can connect with you offline maybe.
Yes, absolutely. That sounds good. So let me see if there are a couple of questions here that I can address. I'm not going to speak too much about legislation because I don't do anything on the regulation side. So I'm really not an expert on that. Let me see. Okay. Maybe I can stop sharing as well. And let me see what other questions. Oh, maybe this is an easy-ish question that I can, easy-ish question I can answer. What kind of timeline is the industry looking at for deployment to get 20% of vehicles in the US to be autonomous? So this is actually not the easiest question to answer, but what they are expecting is that by 2030, autonomous vehicles will not be sort of a novelty on roads anymore, which typically means something like 10 to 20% of vehicles will be autonomous by that point. And as you can see, there were these levels of autonomy that we discussed as well. So they're going to be at different levels of autonomy, but definitely it's going to be around that time frame, so something about 10 to 15 years from now. Do you want me to maybe answer a couple of other questions? Legal challenges. Yeah, I think, and maybe one more connected question. Who takes the blame for malfunction in case of partial autonomy, driver, manufacturer, or designer? So this is a very challenging and interesting area on the legislative side at this point. So typically when it comes to any kind of automotives or any kind of systems that drive on roads, regardless of whether they are automated or not, there is typically so there is a set of regulatory requirements which require you as a car manufacturer to guarantee a certain level of safety. So that means that currently all automotives have to have certain automotive functional safety standards that they have to meet. And it comes down to understanding who was at fault, or whether the driver was following instructions that the vehicle was providing them or not when the accident happens. So the answer to this question is it depends on the situation. So you might have seen a couple of very famous crashes over the last few years. One was the super publicized Tesla crash, which happened just a few days ago, where apparently there were 2 passengers in the Tesla vehicle and none of them was found in the driver's seat at the time of crash. So you can very easily ascribe that behavior or ascribe that blame to the drivers. The Tesla is not meant to be driven right now with no drivers in the driver's seat. But at the same time, this does raise questions down the line of whether you are encouraging such behavior by having practically a fully self-driving vehicle. Like, what are you doing to disincentivize drivers from just quitting the driving role altogether? The other crash, the pretty publicized crash from 2 or 3 years ago, was the Uber crash, which happened at night. And once again, Uber at that point, it was an Uber taxi, which wasn't supposed to be fully autonomous, but you could clearly see a video in which the lady driver was simply doing something on her phone right before the crash happened. And unfortunately, that is going to be the biggest challenge here as compared to the autonomous driving applications themselves, which is that as you start having more and more autonomous features in your vehicle, does that incentivize drivers to just disengage and start and become distracted and cause accidents as a result of that? So it's not because vehicles are over-promising, but it's because drivers are over-assuming in a sense. So maybe, so yeah, it remains like a difficult legal issue to answer, and people are still trying to figure that out. But yeah, I think for the most part, I have answered several questions here. So yeah, thank you all for staying through this time. This was great. Thanks for all the questions as well and for the engagement. Let me know if I can help in any other way. And if you have any other questions, feel free to email them to me. I'm happy to talk later.
Thank you, Radhika, for this wonderful talk where we started off from why we need autonomous vehicles and went on to take us through the challenges, the technologies involved, and as well as the challenges with the technologies, with a wide variety of the whole spectrum of this whole challenges, as well as taking us to the applications and answering this variety of questions. The interest level has been really nice, and I think it really sounds like a lot of people are interested in learning more and going through this and probably spending time on this topic more. So probably we should create some kind of a group where we make some questions and so on. I'll propose that on the various forums and see how people respond. And if that happens, I'll send out an invite to people who want to join, and maybe we could create some kind of at least study group and knowledge sharing group, and see how it goes. And if you want email